So my name is Jamie Drummond. I'm the head of assurance with PKF Global. I'm based in Scotland, in Aberdeen. And I'm here representing both PKF Istanbul and our global network as well. I have to say that I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It's a great honor and a real privilege to be in Turkey. And I've learned a huge amount just today listening to all the amazing presentations. And I think one observation to begin with as well, in my role, I support our member firms on what they're doing on assurance, on audit and sustainability. And on sustainability, I have an understanding of what's happening globally, but it's always a worry to me in my role as to, well, what's happening at a country level? What are our individual firms doing? So it really is incredible to come here and to see what the Institute's doing, to see what's happening in the profession in Turkey on sustainability, and it really is very, very impressive indeed. And before I go any further, I also want to say a big thank you to the translators today. I think I have been the main beneficiary of their excellent services, so thank you very much indeed for that. Now, I've been asked to speak on the S of ESG, on social topics. So I'm not going to talk about environmental or governance issues, the E and the G, both very important. I'm specifically talking on social topics. So what do we mean by that? What's involved in that? Well, we've already talked about quite a lot of them already today. I think the main one that gets a lot of attention these days is diversity, equity and inclusion, DEI. I don't know if you use the DEI acronym in Turkey. You probably have your own local version of that. But I have heard another version of DEI, which includes justice, equity, diversity and inclusion, or JEDI. Better. These are the broad topics on sustainability and social matters. But really, at its heart, what social topics really mean under ESG is the social conscience of an organisation and how it manages the impacts and the risks of its own workforce from an internal perspective, but also workers in the value chain that produce the goods and services that the organisation is responsible for, the communities that are based in the locations where the entity has operations, and the end user, the consumer that is buying the products. These are more of the external considerations. And we see there the double materiality impact, the financial effect of internal considerations, and also the wider impact external to the firm. And I wanted to say a little bit about, well, why are we talking so much about social issues? Why has that really become quite popular and a big priority in recent years? Well, there are different reasons for that. In recent times, we have seen an increase in the amount of litigation against companies for abuses of child labour, modern slavery, and some very big court cases against large multinational companies because of that. That creates risk, and investors are increasingly asking companies to provide more disclosure, more information on these topics and these social topics, so they can understand the risks that they're exposed to as investors. And similarly, consumers are boycotting products that have reputational issues associated with social matters. Increasingly, the modern workforce, the newer generation, are very much attracted to companies that put social issues at the heart of what they do as well. That means that over the past few years, we have seen an increase in legislation, starting from more voluntary legislation soft legislation. But increasingly, if you think about what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in the EU under the CSRD, globally that is becoming more mandatory, harder regulation on social issues, as well as the E and the G also. But all of that comes together from a corporate perspective that businesses are looking at this and thinking, well, this is not just a compliance exercise now, this really needs to be part of the way that we do business and build social issues right into that strategic direction of the company. So as we go through these trends, we see risks emerging, we see opportunities to manage those risks. Compliance is a big part of this now as well, but it prompts companies into action, and action turns inevitably into value for those companies that really take these social issues very, very seriously. In Turkey, you are moving towards mandatory reporting, but in many parts of the world, we still see a lot of voluntary reporting and increasing amounts of voluntary reporting. Now, of course, there are still opportunities for private companies in Turkey and elsewhere to think about the benefits of voluntary reporting. Why would companies voluntarily report on social topics? Well, many companies are developing a social consciousness and they want to get that story across to their stakeholders on what they are doing around social issues, and reporting is a very good way to do that. It builds trust and credibility in terms of the activities that organizations are doing socially if they report on it, particularly where they receive assurance on that reporting. Gives firms a competitive advantage within their value chain if they can say to their customers, who may also have to report on social issues, that we take these social matters very seriously, we have policies in place, and you can rely on our reporting as well, compared maybe to another optional supplier that doesn't have that same rigor and governance over their social reporting. Increasingly, banks and investment decisions, lending, are made with reference to what is it that companies are doing to report and manage social issues and risks. Preparing voluntary reporting on social disclosures is also a great step towards mandatory reporting. And I like to suggest to our firms that there's a great opportunity for them to work with their clients where mandatory reporting is coming in a few years. It's worth thinking about the benefits of voluntary reporting ahead of that, just to create the controls and the disciplines around reporting before it becomes mandatory. It's very attractive to employees these days to know that their employer is focused and cares about social issues, and a great way to attract and retain staff. All of that really adds to the strategic importance of social issues, and we increasingly are seeing firms, as communicated through integrated reports, taking social issues very seriously. And it does, where taken seriously, add to brand value as well. Just on brand value, I thought it was worth giving some examples of companies that are getting a lot of recognition for the efforts that they're going through on social issues. I've taken this from a very recent publication, just in November this year, Sustainability Magazine, and they actually presented a top 10 of companies in terms of the ethical labor practices over different disciplines within social matters. So training, Nestle, a lot of these are large international organizations. Fair wages, IKEA, were very impressive in terms of their approach and policy towards fair payments to their personnel and workers in the supply chain. Development, very similar to training, but more longer term, working with communities to make their roles supporting the company sustainable. Unilever, we're given a lot of credit for that. On community engagement, Patagonia, very often they do appear on social reporting lists of firms that are doing good things. Maybe let me guess, which company is it that got the credit in Sustainability Magazine for their work on ethical sourcing. I don't know if any of you read Sustainability Magazine. I'll give you a clue. The thing that they source is coffee beans. Starbucks, well done, yes. So all of these companies really getting a lot of credit for the work they're doing, but also for the reporting that they provide on social issues as well. And I think this becomes really interesting in terms of all the things that we've been talking about today. These are some excerpts from Starbucks' sustainability report. Don't need to go through all the details, but I think what's interesting here is the style of presentation. This is not just about the numbers on the table, but it's about the story that Starbucks are saying about how they really manage social issues. In this example, these are the human rights. Very important because of the countries in which they locate their raw materials. Maybe some criticisms. I think that they haven't really been very clear in terms of the criteria, the framework that they use. I think this is possibly Starbucks' own criteria rather than an international set of standards. And they don't always publish targets in terms of, well, what are we actually aiming for here? What can we demonstrate by way of whether we achieve those targets or not? Saying that, when it comes to inclusion, diversity, and equality, they have published their goals there as well, which I think is a very, very, very good practice. The other thing about the Starbucks reporting and social matters is that they receive assurance on that. So this is voluntary reporting. They're not required to do this in the US. They're not required to do the reporting, and they're not required to gain assurance on it. But they choose to. And selectively, they've identified which of the topics within social matters that they will receive the assurance on. In this case, it's mainly around the sourcing of coffee purchases, and cocoa and tea, but also around the reporting of investments that they make in providing loans to farms that they do business with as well. And the assurance has been provided by an American CPA firm using the AICPA attestation standards. Incidentally, the other 4 companies that I talked about, they also do voluntary reporting, a lot of it very clear, very interesting, but they don't all obtain assurance on that. So when it comes to social topics, what are the main frameworks that apply, that guide us in terms of what to report on? Well, there are voluntary standards. As we heard earlier today from IFAC with Dave Madden, the most common standard for reporting is the GRI standards. Those are a broad set of topical standards. The SASB standards are also very popular. They're probably the second most popular set of standards. Those are industry-specific standards. We'll talk a little bit more about those in the next slides coming up. But also, another voluntary set of standards is the entity's own criteria. They don't have to use published standards. Published standards are very helpful, they add credibility, but there's nothing to stop a company or a business reporting on matters that are important to them and defining their own criteria. And of course, when it comes to reporting, a business can use a mix of these. So we're seeing some companies reporting using both SASB standards and GRI standards. But we now are seeing more and more mandatory standards coming out. In Turkey, you have the Turkish version of the IFRS standards of sustainability. And of course, in the EU, we have the EFRAG standards issued under the CSRD. And I think as we go forward over the next few years, we're going to see more and more mandatory reporting. Hopefully there will be some consolidation in that. A big challenge for our profession is the fragmentation, the amount of different standards that are out there. But there are efforts being made that as we move forward, there will be some consolidation and consistency. There's certainly a big focus on the interoperability of these standards. When it comes to IFRS, and IFRS S1 and S2, S1 being the general standard and S2 focusing on climate-related disclosures, S1 permits the user to refer to the SASB standards to identify material topics for disclosure, which I think is very, very helpful. It also does permit the use and reference to GRI and to ESRS standards as well. So you may find that your clients will be making reference potentially to all of these standards if we think about the totality of their reporting. So SASB standards, the reason I wanted to focus on this was just very quickly to give you an example of why it is that different industries, different sectors focus on different types of social metrics and topics. So the SASB standards, there are 77 standards out there, 77 different industries. I'm not going to run through all of them, but just selected a couple, or 4, that you might find interesting. So what is it in terms of social issues that SASB requires energy utilities and power generation companies to report on? There are 2 topics on social issues. First is energy affordability. Secondly, it's health and safety, protection of the workforce. I think interestingly, the standards also outline the risks, the impacts of these areas, why they're relevant, and it gives some insight into the opportunities for businesses and companies if they have a policy to address these areas as well. And then importantly, it specifies what are the metrics that are required to be disclosed for these topics. So for example, in health and safety, that includes reporting on fatalities and near misses as well within the workforce. Just let's look at some others. Commercial banks. So what kind of social topics would be important for banks to report on specifically? Now there's nothing to stop banks from having their own social metrics and things that are very important to them. But as a minimum, SASB suggests that the following 2 topics should be reported on by banks. Financial inclusion and capacity building. That means lending to everybody and not being exclusive in terms of who the banks are lending to. And also the consideration of social factors that go into credit scoring and the lending decision. So again, plenty of information in the standards about the risks, the impacts, the opportunities for companies to deal with these issues, and the confirmation of what's required for disclosure. Household and personal products, focus there on the safety measures, the use of chemicals in producing household products, the risks there to society in general through the use of concerning chemicals, and also the effects of the use of palm oil in the production of household and personal products as well. Finally, just one last industry here, professional services. I thought this was interesting because we can maybe reflect on what that means for our profession in audit and accounting. So again, what do you think would be the social topics that SASB requires disclosure on for professional services? What's important to you at your firms on the social side of ESG? Well, again, there could be lots of social issues that voluntarily professional service firms might want to report on that are important to their staff, their communities. But the point that SASB requires professional service firms to report on is workforce diversity and engagement, recognizing that there may be risks that a firm, a profession is held back if it is not inclusive in terms of particularly the senior level, the board level of that company. And required metrics on gender, diversity, representation, particularly at an executive level. So that's just a little bit of background about the social topics. I just wanted to then focus on what are the challenges from a reporting perspective, but also from an assurance perspective. And I think this is interesting to me because I think this is where the opportunity is for our profession. I did want to focus on 3 in particular, but I think all of these points do have a role to play in terms of the challenges. So when entities are getting ready to report on social issues, what kind of problems will they face? I think the double materiality assessment, or just even the single materiality assessment, is difficult. And that's because there is such a wide group of stakeholders that can contribute to that thinking. The communities in which the organisation has operations, its own workforce, but the external workforce within the supply chain that works producing the raw materials that go into the product, and the end user, the consumer. All of those groups will have views on what's important to them. It's a very personal decision to say, well, me as an individual, this is why I feel this is an important social topic. So getting around that community of individuals is a very big undertaking, and businesses are really not used to doing this activity. So this is a new activity, very time-consuming task to go through. One thing I would say about all of these challenges for reporting, I think the good news is that when it comes to social topics within ESG, my view is that they're really not very complex. Now, I might stand to be corrected in that. We might find some really difficult, complex issues in the years ahead, but I compare that to what we're used to as a profession in terms of auditing derivative financial instruments and complex valuation models in historic financial information. Social issues for ESG reporting don't really have that level of complexity, but there are problems that are there nonetheless. We've talked a lot about them today as well, particularly around the data that goes into preparing the report and all the various data points that are required to be gathered. Chances are, for most businesses, there will not be sophisticated platforms to record that. A lot of entities and businesses will be using Excel spreadsheets, resorting to email, both to do the materiality assessment and to prepare the information that ultimately ends up in the sustainability report. So data management is a huge area and a huge challenge for companies, even though the underlying subject matter is maybe less complex. But the good news for our profession is that that allows us the opportunity to support our clients as they implement IT systems for that. We are seeing businesses and our firms who advise them being very interested in platforms like Caseware, LucaNet, Social Suite, very robust platforms that are aligned with the SASB standards, CSRD, etc. Finding that very helpful to get through all of this work. The lack of industry standardization is a problem because when companies are coming up to reporting, they will naturally want to know, well, what are other companies in our sector saying about social matters in their reporting? How do we compare against them? Well, the problem is there isn't much to compare against. There isn't much to compare against in terms of identifying material topics to disclose, or the presentation of how those appear in the report. But I think that's an important topic to deal with because the reporting is very, very important. I showed you the Starbucks report, an example there. I think it's very important that when it comes to social matters, what we shouldn't see is just a page of numbers, a table of metrics. That might tick the box in terms of a compliance approach, but it doesn't give much insight. It's not particularly meaningful for the users of that report, for stakeholders. And I think for companies ultimately to get the value through integrated reporting, there has to be a good story that's being told, an authentic story that really reflects what it is that the company is doing on social matters. And again, I think companies will be looking for support in terms of how they prepare the presentation of their report as well. And I think, and again, as a profession, we're very well placed to help them out with that. But another challenge here is avoiding bad publicity. And I think it will be very damaging reputationally to a company if they have a track record of producing social metrics, social disclosures, and then down the line, they find that there's a problem, they got it wrong. Actually, there are some child labor issues in our supply chain, or we've fallen foul of modern slavery, etc., etc. So that comes down to, I think in large part, very rigorous vendor due diligence, getting ahead of these issues, understanding where these risks lie within the supply chain, and knowing that the vendors that we use are reliable as well. Finally, on the challenges for insurance provider, again, I've talked a lot about many of these as well. They're the same challenges for the reporting entity, but I think above all else, we've got to think about professional skepticism. How do we go into an engagement? How do we stay alert for greenwashing, or in this case, social washing, when we're not used to it? This is all very new for us. We're all going through a very, very steep learning curve. We don't have those years of experience that we have when we're doing audits of historic financial information. So how do we know that we can apply professional skepticism and be alert for errors and potentially for fraud? I think that comes down to pricing the engagements fairly, giving ourselves time, but also working with clients before they get to the reporting stage, advising them, giving them feedback and controls, helping them get to the stage where some of those risks are minimised before we get involved as a profession. Last slide is just to say that I think there are some critical success factors to embedding ESG. We've talked about the risk assessment, data and reporting. Prioritising, in my mind, is big because I think we're going to see many ideas, suggestions from staff, from other stakeholders in terms of what their companies should be doing on social issues. And of course, companies need to comply with legislation as well. I think it's important that they can prioritise which of these issues are the ones that are going to add most strategic value to our company, where do we put our resources. We've got to make sure that we integrate social with the E and the G as well as the financial reporting as well. I think most important though is that senior leadership get behind this, that they lead by example, they help to embed a culture of social consciousness within the organisation. And I think I'll just end by saying that I think the leadership on this topic that I'm seeing in Turkey, I think stands the country in very good stead when it comes to the importance and the role of leadership, taking this topic very, very seriously. That's it for me. Thank you very much.